One morning, in the hallway of Peppa Pig's house, a tiny, dark spot appeared. It didn't look frightening at all, just like someone had tracked in dirt from outside. No one in the family paid attention. Mummy Pig wiped it with a cloth, but the stain didn't disappear. It only became blurrier. With each passing day, it grew. At first slowly, then faster, spreading across the walls and floor in thin, oily streaks. They looked like ink flowing in water. Sometimes their shapes resembled strange signs or letters. Must be some kind of mold, Daddy Pig said, grabbing a bucket and a brush. He scrubbed at the wall, but it was useless. The ink seemed to sink deeper inside, leaving behind even more twisted marks. By the third day, the inky lines had reached Peppa's room. She watched with unease as they slithered across the wallpaper, almost alive. It felt like they were whispering, quietly, barely audible, yet enough to send chills down her back. Labubu sat motionless on her bed. His glassy eyes gleamed in the dim light of the night lamp. Normally, the toy seemed cute and funny, but now his smile looked mocking, alien. As the ink crept closer to the bed, Peppa thought Labubu tilted his head slightly, watching them. That night, Peppa awoke to the faint sound of dripping liquid. She turned on her nightlight and saw a small puddle of ink was forming on the floor. Thin lines stretched out from it, curling into a circle. Peppa clamped her hooves over her mouth to stop a scream and pulled the blanket tighter around herself. "Labubu," she whispered, as if expecting comfort. The toy sat at the edge of the pillow. His eyes seemed to reflect the inky streaks. For a moment, Peppa thought he blinked. By the fifth day, ink had filled half her room. It would vanish, then reappear, forming pulsating patterns. And then, among those patterns, words began to take shape. At first, scribbles, unreadable, but then they came together into a clear message. "I see," Peppa screamed. Her voice broke with panic. The ink rippled, shivered, as if answering her cry, and then vanished, leaving only damp stains on the wall. Mummy Pig rushed in at the noise. "Peppa, what happened?" she asked. "There, it was writing." Peppa pointed to the wallpaper, but nothing remained. Mummy sighed and smiled. "Just a nightmare, darling. Go back to bed." But Peppa knew it wasn't a dream. She turned to Labubu. His eyes now glowed faintly red, reflecting the word she had seen. His smile grew wider. That night, Peppa couldn't sleep. Ink seeped back onto the walls. It writhed, folding into new shapes. This time, Labubu didn't sit quietly. He was at the very center of the pattern, the lines of ink wrapped around him, as if marking him as part of it all. Peppa shivered when she heard a whisper, faint but clear. It came either from the walls or directly from Labubu. "We see. We wait." She squeezed her eyes shut, but when she opened them again, new words had appeared on the wall. "Soon." She tried to run, but the door was covered in black streaks and the handle wouldn't move. Peppa whimpered, clutching Labubu tight, though she knew he was part of the horror. Suddenly, the ink retreated into the walls, leaving the room empty and dead. The silence was deafening. The next morning, her parents behaved as if nothing had happened. Only Ivy, her baby sister, stared at Peppa with an odd expression. Her tiny hands reached for Labubu, and she cried whenever the toy was taken away. Peppa realized Ivy could feel the ink too. That night, the stain appeared again, this time beneath Ivy's crib. The ink stirred, forming the shape of a hand, as if someone was reaching out from inside. Peppa rushed to her sister, but Labubu slid off her bed on his own and stopped right next to the inky hand. His eyes flared bright red. The ink crept upward along the crib's legs. Ivy screamed. "No!" Peppa cried, grabbing Labubu and holding him tight. The ink froze. Words spread across the wall. "You are already ours!" And at that moment, Peppa understood. The ink would never leave. It had come for them. And Labubu wasn't just a toy. He was a witness or a guide. The toy trembled in her hooves, his smile wider than ever before. He was waiting.
Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. Peppa always brushed her teeth before bed. But tonight something was different about the bathroom mirror. Her reflection seemed to lag behind her movements, creating a disorienting effect that made her feel dizzy. When she raised her toothbrush, her reflection waited a full second before doing the same. When she smiled, her reflection frowned. When she waved, her reflection turned away. Peppa tried to ignore it and continue brushing her teeth, but the reflection began to act independently, brushing its teeth with movements that didn't match her own. The reflection Peppa opened her mouth wide, revealing teeth that were too sharp and too numerous, filling her mouth like a shark's. Real Peppa dropped her toothbrush in shock, but reflection Peppa continued brushing with mechanical precision. The reflection began to mouth words that Peppa couldn't hear, its lips moving urgently as if trying to warn her about something. Suddenly, the reflection pressed its hands against the glass from the inside, and Peppa could see that its fingers were too long, with nails that had grown into claws. The reflection began to push harder against the mirror, and cracks started to appear in the glass, spreading outward from where its hands pressed. As the cracks grew larger, Peppa could hear muffled sounds coming from the other side of the mirror, sounds like crying, like screaming, like someone trapped and desperate to escape. The reflection Peppa's mouth opened wider and wider until it seemed to take up most of its face, and from that impossible mouth came a sound like breaking glass mixed with her own voice calling for help. The mirror finally shattered, but instead of glass falling to the floor, the pieces hung in the air, each one showing a different reflection of Peppa, all of them wrong in their own terrifying way. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. Peppa woke up thirsty in the middle of the night and went downstairs to the kitchen for a glass of water. The house was dark and quiet, with only the soft hum of the refrigerator breaking the silence. As she reached for a glass, she noticed that all the kitchen appliances were on, their displays glowing in the darkness, but she was certain they had been turned off before bedtime. The microwave showed midnight but was running anyway, its turntable spinning endlessly. The oven was preheating to a temperature that didn't exist on its dial, and the dishwasher was running a cycle that seemed to go on forever. When she opened the refrigerator for water, she found it completely empty except for a single plate covered with a silver dome. Despite knowing she shouldn't, Peppa lifted the dome and found a birthday cake with candles that lit themselves as she watched. The cake was decorated with a message written in frosting that read, "Happy birthday, Peppa." But today wasn't her birthday, and the handwriting looked like her own. As she stared at the cake, the candles began to multiply, covering the entire surface until the cake was more flame than food. The kitchen filled with the sound of children singing "Happy Birthday," but the voices were coming from inside the walls, muffled and distorted. The singing grew louder and more discordant, and Peppa realized that the voices belonged to children who sounded exactly like her, all singing at slightly different speeds. The cake began to melt from the heat of the countless candles, but instead of frosting and cake, thick red liquid pooled on the plate. The singing stopped abruptly, and in the sudden silence, Peppa heard her own voice whisper from behind her, "Make a wish."
Peppa Pig, Eyes in the Dark. In the pig family's house, an unusual silence reigned. Lately, George had hardly spoken to his sister. He no longer played with his dinosaur, didn't ask for bedtime stories, and didn't laugh the way he used to. Instead, he spent long hours sitting at the table by the window, clutching a pencil. Sheets of paper were scattered everywhere, on the floor, on the chair, even by the bed. All of them were covered with the same strange symbols, circles with short lines, resembling eyes. "George, what are these drawings?" Peppa asked cautiously. Her brother slowly turned to her. His gaze was unusual, heavy, and somehow too grown up. "You'll find out soon," he whispered, and bent over the papers again. Peppa felt her little hooves grow cold. George was becoming more and more withdrawn, as if his attention was fixed on something she couldn't see. One night, when they were both already lying in their beds, Peppa noticed that George wasn't asleep. He sat right on his sheets, staring at the ceiling. His eyes shimmered strangely, reflecting the moonlight. But there was no warmth in that gleam. It felt as if a bottomless depth was hiding inside them, one she could fall into. "George," Peppa whispered. He didn't answer. He only smiled, in a way he had never smiled before. The next morning, George's bed was empty. His favorite dinosaur lay torn to pieces on the floor. Above his pillow, on the wall, scratches had appeared. Symbols like eyes, as if someone had carved them with a sharp claw. "George!" Peppa called. But the room remained silent. She rushed through the house, searching for her brother in the garden, the kitchen, the living room. But George was nowhere. Everything around her felt too quiet, as if time itself had stopped. When Peppa returned to their room, her eyes fell on the large mirror hanging on the wall. Her heart froze. In the reflection behind her stood George. She spun around quickly. No one was there. But in the mirror, he remained, staring. His eyes glowed with a dim, sickly light, and his lips stretched into a smile. Peppa backed away, and then she noticed that next to George in the reflection sat Labubu. The toy looked almost the same as always, but its eyes flickered with a red glow. On its face lingered the same eerie smile as George's. "George is no more," came a strange voice from the mirror. It was low, drawn out, and echoed both in the room and inside her head. Peppa pressed herself to the wall. The surface of the mirror rippled like water. The shapes of George and Labubu moved forward, toward the glass. Their outlines became sharper, as if they were about to break through. "No!" Peppa screamed. She dashed toward the door, but suddenly froze. In the mirror, her own bed reflected as empty, and on it sat Labubu, very close now, with glowing eyes and a crooked smile. The mirror trembled, and the shadows nearly tore their way out. Peppa squeezed her eyes shut, unable to look. When she opened them again, the mirror was ordinary. The room was silent. Only George's bed remained empty. Later that night, when their parents had gone to sleep, Peppa sat on her bed, staring at the shelf where Labubu now stood again. He looked harmless, soft and familiar, but now she knew the truth. His eyes were no longer lifeless buttons. In their dim glow flickered the same cold emptiness she had seen in George, and in the corner of the room, near the mirror, a crack was slowly spreading. It widened as if something unseen was watching from behind the wall.
Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. Daddy Pig was in his study, engrossed in his newspaper. But the rustling of the pages sounded like dry, brittle wings. The antique globe on his desk spun slowly on its own, its continents shifting and blurring. A faint, musty smell filled the room. The ink on the newspaper began to bleed, forming strange, cryptic symbols. Daddy Pig seemed oblivious. The bookshelves appeared to lean precariously. A cold draft swept through the room. Peppa tiptoed to the study door. The familiar ticking of Daddy Pig /S watch had morphed into a slow, deliberate thumping. The air grew heavy. The symbols on the newspaper began to glow with a faint, sickly green light. Daddy Pig looked up, his eyes wide and unseeing. He spoke, but his voice was not his own. He gestured towards the globe, which now pulsed with the same green light. The continents on it rearranged themselves into a map of an unknown, terrifying place. The books on the shelves began to fall. The study was no longer a place of quiet contemplation. Peppa backed away, her heart pounding. The thumping of the watch grew louder. The green light intensified. Daddy Pig rose from his chair, his movements stiff and unnatural. The study door slammed shut, trapping her inside. The air grew thick with an unseen presence. The house was no longer a home, but a predator. The finality of her fate hung heavy in the air. The walls seemed to close in. There was no escape, no hope. Only the hungry silence and the unblinking eye of their doom. The house had claimed its prize, and the game was over. For now.
Peppa Pig, The Cracks. It started as just a tiny line, almost invisible in the corner of Peppa's bedroom. She thought it was just a crack in the paint. Maybe someone had bumped into the wall. "Mummy, look," she said that evening, pointing. Mummy Pig glanced over, nodded and said, "The house has probably settled a bit. Nothing to worry about. Daddy will fix it." But Daddy forgot, and the crack stayed. The next day, Peppa noticed it had grown longer. Now it stretched upward slightly, like a tree branch reaching toward the ceiling. "That's strange," she muttered. "Maybe I'm imagining it." But each day, the crack grew, first thin, then a little wider. After a few days, it curved unnaturally, like someone had drawn it with a finger. More cracks appeared nearby, one, then another. "Is our house okay?" Peppa asked Daddy Pig. "Of course," he laughed. "Walls crack sometimes. We'll fix it." They never did. A week later, the whole wall was laced with thin cracks. Some of them vanished during the day, only to return by night. One night, Peppa woke up and saw the crack moving, slightly, as if something inside was breathing. She got out of bed and walked closer, pressed her ear against it. Inside, a sound. Very quiet, scraping. A knock, slow, 3 taps, a pause, 2 more. Peppa jumped back. "George," she whispered. Her brother was asleep, breathing steadily. In the morning, she found a small, dusty scrap of paper beneath the crack, very old, almost falling apart. On it, a single word, "Open." Peppa didn't tell her parents. She covered the crack with bandages, several layers, then hung a picture over it. But by nightfall, the picture had fallen. The tape was torn away. New lines appeared on the wall, not cracks anymore, almost like letters. She backed away to the door, but the door wouldn't open. Something inside the wall was moving, slowly, like it was exhaling. She screamed. Mummy and Daddy rushed in. It's," Peppa gasped, pointing. But on the wall, nothing, no cracks, no words, just a perfectly smooth surface. "You probably had a bad dream," said Mummy Pig gently. "Let's try to forget about it." But Peppa couldn't forget, because that night, when she turned to face the wall, she saw movement right where the crack had been, and then a voice, a whisper. "I'm almost out. Don't turn around."
Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. Peppa was playing with her toy train set in the living room. The train, usually so cheerful, began to make strange, clanking noises, and its lights flickered erratically. She tried to stop it, but it sped up, circling the room faster and faster, leaving a trail of dark, oily smoke. The smoke filled the room, making it hard to see, and the clanking grew louder, more menacing. The train cars transformed, their windows becoming empty, staring eyes, and their wheels grinding like teeth. Pause 30 seconds. Peppa stumbled back, her heart pounding. The train was no longer a toy, but a monstrous entity, chasing her around the room. She could hear faint whispers coming from the train, calling her name, inviting her to join its endless journey. The room grew colder, and the shadows danced around her, making the distorted train seem to come alive. She closed her eyes, wishing it was all a dream, but the cold touch on her cheek told her it was terrifyingly real. Pause 30 seconds. When she opened them again, the train was gone, but the tracks were etched into the floor, glowing with an eerie green light. She knew she was trapped. The house creaked and groaned around her, each sound a chilling reminder of the presence lurking within. She could hear faint whispers, carried on the wind, calling her name. The air grew heavy, and a strange, sweet smell filled the room, making her dizzy. She felt a cold touch on her ankle, and a shiver ran down her spine. Peppa knew she wasn't alone. Pause 30 seconds. The shadows in her room seemed to deepen, twisting into grotesque shapes. She could feel eyes watching her from every corner. The house was no longer a safe haven, but a trap. She pulled the covers over her head, but the whispers grew louder, more insistent. She knew she had to escape, but where could she go? The house was alive and it wanted her. She could hear the floorboards groaning, the walls creaking, as if the house itself was closing in on her. The air was thick with an unseen presence, and she felt a suffocating weight on her chest. Peppa knew this was the end. The last thing she saw before darkness consumed her was the glowing green tracks, leading into an abyss. And then nothing, just the silence of the house, waiting for its next victim. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. Peppa's playroom had always been her favorite place in the house, filled with colorful toys and games that brought her joy. But tonight, as she entered to retrieve a forgotten book, the room felt different. All of her toys were arranged in a perfect circle in the center of the room, facing inward as if they were having a meeting. The toy telephone was off its hook, emitting a soft dial tone that filled the room with an eerie hum. Her stuffed animals sat upright with their button eyes all turned toward the same spot, the empty space in the center of their circle. As Peppa watched, the toys began to move closer together, tightening their circle with small, jerky movements. The toy piano began to play a melody by itself, its keys depressing with invisible fingers, creating a tune that sounded almost familiar but wrong, like a lullaby played backwards. Her building blocks started to stack themselves into towers that defied gravity, balancing in impossible configurations that should have fallen but didn't. The jack-in-the-box began to turn its handle slowly, the tinny music playing at half speed, creating an ominous countdown to something terrible. Peppa tried to leave the room, but the door slammed shut behind her with a force that shook the walls. The toys all turned to look at her simultaneously, their painted faces seeming more alive than they had any right to be. The stuffed animals' button eyes began to glow with a soft, sickly light, and their stitched mouths appeared to move as if they were trying to speak. The jack-in-the-box finally popped open, but instead of the usual clown, a tiny figure that looked exactly like Peppa emerged, its face twisted into an expression of pure terror. The toy Peppa pointed at the real Peppa and opened its mouth in a silent scream, and all the other toys began to move toward her, their movements becoming more fluid and lifelike with each step. The room filled with the sound of mechanical laughter, growing louder and more distorted until it became a cacophony of madness that seemed to come from the toys themselves.